The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A., and I am pleased to have as my guest Molly Morabito. Molly Morabito is a climate organizer with the Climate Law Institute to support communities mobilizing for a just transition off fossil fuels. Prior to joining the center, she worked in environmental justice advocacy and clean energy research. She holds a Master's of Science in Environmental Policy and Regulation from the London School of Economics and a Bachelor's in Communications Law, Economics, and Government from American University. Her organization put out a report earlier this year on the climate president's emergency powers. Molly Morabito, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to dive right into this recent report, the Climate President's Emergency Powers, that the Center for Biological Diversity put out in collaboration with the Climate Law Institute. And we have been seeing, climate change is with us now. We're seeing evidence of serious global heating going on, even as we speak. And in many parts of the world, it's much more profound and evident even than it is in much of the United States. But why is executive action needed? Wouldn't climate legislation from Congress be a better way?
Yeah, so that's definitely a framework that has been pervasive in the climate movement spaces. And to be clear, no one at the center opposes climate legislation from Congress. That's definitely a possibility. What we've seen, however, is that Congress is captured by gridlock and a lot of corporate influence that has made climate action unlikely and sometimes even impossible from Congress. And we've seen already, just in the course of the last year and a half, a number of negotiations where we came very close to a climate spending bill. There was a dollar amount on the table. There were negotiations happening. It consumed the press. It consumed folks working in advocacy. And then at the last second, one senator or a few senators pulled back, in addition to the, many other members of Congress who won't vote on climate at all. And so we're just seeing that pathway, the legislative pathway, doesn't seem likely. I know that there has been a new resurgence of negotiations, a new round, but we have to question the motivations behind these negotiations, seeing what Manchin has done again and again, and his ties, his direct benefit from the fossil fuel industry, particularly in coal and the processing that happens from his coal plant. We have to question his motivations and where these negotiations may go. So the reason we focus on executive action and have been focused on executive action for many years is because there's a number of existing powers that the president has, any president has, to address the climate crisis with or without climate legislation. So in an ideal world, those things would go hand in hand and we would have both. But in a world where we may not have the legislation, we should absolutely be calling and demanding that the president step up, who was elected on a promise to be a climate leader, and deliver on that promise through the powers he has and could have used from day one. So we've really been waiting for Biden, and Biden has been, waiting for Congress. And we're at a moment where we can't afford to wait anymore. We need action yesterday, but we especially need it now. And waiting to see how these latest negotiations pan out might cost us vital time to address the climate crisis when communities across the country are hurting deeply right now. So we need Biden to lead in this moment.
Yeah, and he has over and over affirmed the importance of doing something about climate and its urgency. But has he taken any action? Have there been any executive actions so far at all that are meaningful?
There have been executive actions. We've seen the president step up, even before the latest negotiation in Congress fell apart. Biden did enact the Defense Production Act to scale up the manufacturing of renewable energy technologies, including solar panels and energy efficiency technologies to improve insulation, weatherization technologies, things like that. That's exactly what we've been calling for Biden to do. It's part of a tapestry of powers he has. We'd like to see him go further, but it was a really important first step because that was one of the powers we actually identified in the climate report, identifying there's 5 regulatory frameworks that Biden can use, and the Defense Production Act is one of them. And that allowed him to direct federal funds through agencies to the manufacturing of renewable technologies. He can build on that through other pieces of regulation and by declaring a climate emergency, but that was the first step. Since then, since the negotiations fell apart, he has also gone on record saying that he would use more executive action to address the climate crisis. We've seen some workplace standards for heat come through, orders around streamlining offshore wind, 2.3 billion directed for FEMA to build more resilient building technologies, and 3.1 billion to weatherize homes for low-income Americans. These are all great steps. They matter, and they're definitely moving us in the right direction, but they're not going far enough. We need actions that match the scale and urgency of the climate crisis. So we're hoping that these steps in the right direction are going to lead to the leaps and sprint that we actually need for this race.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there's statutory powers he has. Does it require a declaration of a climate emergency for all of those, or just some of them?
Yeah, so there is the declaration of a climate emergency would unlock important powers to help shift off of fossil fuels. The first is the ability to ban crude oil exports, reinstating actually the crude oil ban, which we've had before, and then stopping foreign fossil fuel investment. He could halt the flow of hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. federal investment in fossil fuel projects abroad that would prevent locking in more reliance on fossil fuel infrastructure. And he could roll out renewable energy and electric transportation infrastructure through an emergency declaration. Specifically, he could direct Pentagon funds toward pieces that would ensure our climate security with renewable energy systems that would just shore up the grid and make us a lot more energy independent and create climate resilient technologies at scale. So that's through the emergency declaration specifically. But there are powers that go beyond that. And in fact, there's existing non-emergency powers that are already in Biden's toolkit. So that includes stopping the leasing for oil and gas on our national public lands and waters, specifically canceling onshore lease sales, which went through in June while so much has been going on.
Right.
Unfortunately, they were auctioning off lands in June for more oil and gas drilling, which is just something we don't need right now, and it will drive us further into the climate crisis.
Yeah.
So
like
he could
keep it in the ground.
That.
Yeah, and I understand we've actually had more oil and gas leases with Biden in office than we had with Trump in office.
That's right. It's kind of hard to believe. I mean, that started with the auctioning off of 80 million acres in the Gulf Coast in 2021. And then now this onshore sale, and the Department of Interior under Biden's administration is considering a plan for a 5-year offshore leasing that would open up more acres in the Gulf Coast to drilling, and even acres in the Cook Inlet, where most recently the administration canceled that sale because there wasn't even any interest from industry. That's just land and water that doesn't have to be drilled. So these kinds of discouraging signals from the administration, and he has the power right now to stop all of this leasing. So we're really hoping to mobilize, get out the message that he needs to do this now.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned, in regard, along with the export of crude oil, you also mentioned investment in oil and gas infrastructure, and you said that there's federal dollars that are part of that investment. How does the federal government get involved in investments in fossil fuel infrastructure?
Well, I mean, the first way that I think about, the federal investment, we subsidize the fossil fuel industry by the millions. And that's like, it's funny to hear people talk about inflation. Like, what are we going to do about inflation if we put all of this spending towards clean energy and climate initiatives? We're putting a ton of money towards fossil fuels and nobody really bats an eye. So that's one place where, the federal government is directing that flow rather than propping up the industries that could save us and transition us from fossil fuels. They're propping up an old industry that is really just not needed right now. I mean, we need to think about the pieces of a transition, and it's not going to be an instantaneous thing, but it starts by redirecting that funding and those subsidies out of fossil fuels and into clean energy. And that's something that the president can do. It certainly can come from Congress, but the president has powers to shift that flow.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess if it were a change in tax laws, because there are a lot of tax subsidies for fossil fuels, that would still have to come out of Congress. But the president then, does he have extra powers beyond that?
Well, the president can halt the hundreds of billions of dollars of private investment, U.S. investment in fossil fuel projects abroad. That's actually something that could be enacted under the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So that would grant the ability to restrict international trade and private investment in fossil fuels across borders.
Okay.
But within the U.S., the question of subsidization of fossil fuel industries, that is a little bit within the executive branch, and it also is, those subsidies are also directed by Congress.
Yeah.
But the flow of money across our borders to projects that are polluting people in other countries, the president can stop that.
Yeah, and that would include banks investing in such projects, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Great. And you mentioned stopping the export of crude oil. We obviously export finished petroleum products, gasoline or whatever it happens to be, jet fuel. But we are also now exporting crude, I understand. So would the president's powers include being able to stop all exports? And is that something that the Center for Biological Diversity or other groups are calling for?
Yeah. So with the crude oil exports, after declaring a national climate emergency, the president would be able to reinstate the crude oil export ban that was overturned in 2015. And that power applies specifically to the crude oil export ban. The other exports could be controlled through a few different channels. But there are certainly groups who are calling for the end of all exports particularly out of the Gulf Coast, where the brunt of the cost of that exporting is borne. So that's a piece that lots of groups, a lot of environmental justice groups in particular, have been organizing around for a while, and declaring a national emergency would kick that off by putting back a ban that was in place already, and would help cut greenhouse gas emissions by the same amount as closing 42 coal plants per year.
Wow.
It would cut emissions per year the same of 42 coal plants.
Yeah, that's significant. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Molly Morabito. She is with the Climate Law Institute, and we've been talking about the information included in a report put together by the Center for Biological Diversity and the Climate Law Institute entitled The Climate President's Emergency Powers. That report, by the way, if you just put in your favorite browser, Climate President's Emergency Powers, you can actually access that report and download a copy. If you want to get into the details, it's, I believe, 50 some pages. So a lot of legal research and really great data included in that. Now, when we start talking about, cutting back on fossil fuel leases, on fossil fuel exports, right now there's kind of a disruption in the usual, what we might call usual, global energy distribution that's been caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there's been a lot of talk about, changing markets and more demand for U.S. exports and that kind of thing. Does that war, do the issues stemming from that war complicate this issue at all?
Absolutely. I mean, particularly, I would say it complicates public sentiment and understanding of what we're calling for, and it makes the demand a little more complicated because Americans are hurting. They're hurting right now at the pump. We've seen the cost of fuel skyrocket since the invasion, and obviously our allies across the world are losing a source of fuel that they needed, and I think everyone wants to help our allies in Europe, but there's a little bit of misunderstanding around what a crude oil export ban would do. There's really, I think there's still, we wouldn't necessarily be limiting all the help that we could offer. And I think an important point is that it wouldn't actually necessarily affect gas prices at the pump here domestically. So I think that's one area that's been a little bit complicated by media coverage and just the talking points that are out there.
Yeah, and with crude oil, if you ban the export of crude, that seems like that would shift some of the refining market back to the United States, because there's really nothing you can do with crude oil without refining it into other products. In that sense, you could say, well, it actually enhances our domestic supply in a sense. Who knows? I don't know the answer on that question, but it seemed like, as you said, it creates some problems with public sentiment. It doesn't sound good if you're worried about the price of gas, but on the other hand, it could actually have no impact or a beneficial impact on the price.
Yeah, I think that the important framing here is that ultimately we need to figure out a transition off of these fuel sources for the long term, and that's going to ultimately increase our national security, our energy independence, and it will help other countries with their transition. And our, allies in Europe have already indicated that they're investing in clean energy solutions to avoid this type of issue in the future. Oil and gas will always be a global commodity. It will always be subject to the volatility of global markets. But energy that we produce domestically, which is what clean energy is not subject to the same volatility and is a lot more reliable and safer. So the long-term investments and the investments that need to start now have to be in that direction, so that we're reducing the need for this, we're reducing the likelihood for this type of impact in the future, and we're increasing our own resilience and security.
Yeah, and if we had started moving faster in that transition 10 years or 20 years ago, we'd be much less vulnerable to this sort of price spiking and manipulation than we are now.
Absolutely.
So one of the things the report deals with is the climate emergency's impacts on the United States and the threats that it poses to the United States, the climate emergency itself. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's incredible how every year those impacts become more real and hit closer and closer to home. I live in California. I'm in the Bay Area, and I actually have family that was just in Yosemite and had to clear out and evacuate because of the fire, the oak fire that is raging in that part of the state, consuming thousands and tens of thousands of acres, and still is not contained. And those fires are increasingly common here in California because of the drought that we experienced, the high heat and intensity, the changing weather patterns that are fueled by the climate crisis, and the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on our atmosphere. This is just in my backyard, and this is just in my community. But across the US, we're experiencing more increasingly severe heat waves. We're in one right now. And last year, there was a heat wave in the Pacific Northwest that killed hundreds of people. I mean, we don't really talk about it, but people are dying from the climate crisis now in this country because of impacts that were predicted long ago. And actually, those impacts are happening faster and at a higher severity than even some of the worst case scenarios were predicting 10 years ago. Right. So I just think, I mean, you just need to look outside and read the news to see the impacts. And people know that. I mean, the polling on the climate emergency and specifically the desire to see government step up and our federal government take action on the climate crisis has been going up over the past few years. Every year, we're polling higher and higher. A majority of Americans want to see climate action from our government because we're seeing the climate impacts. And every year that we wait will affect how much the planet warms. And every eighth of a degree of warming that we can save ourselves will save lives in the millions. So I think the impacts are pretty stark, and it just builds the demand and the need for action from our federal government and Biden, who has the action to do that, to declare a climate emergency today.
Yeah. And the impacts are even more severe in other parts of the world where we're already beginning to see, declining crop yields or even outright crop failures in major portions of Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Within the tropics or close to the tropic latitudes, the heat and dryness is totally unprecedented, and it's affecting, how much food people can produce, which is contributing also to the pressures for migration, because when people can't make a living where they live, they've got to go somewhere else. So we're seeing a lot of that. The report mentions one simple equation. Each degree centigrade of temperature rise is estimated to decrease the U.S. gross domestic product by 1.2%. And of course, the poorest regions suffer the most when that happens. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimated that since 1980, the U.S. has experienced more than 310 weather and climate disasters amounting to over $2.1 trillion in damages. That's a lot. I mean, this is when we're talking about the economy hurting. These are things that have contributed to enormous loss and to the national debt, and we're not solving the problem. You were talking about the executive actions Biden can take, and some that he's already taken without declaring a climate emergency. What kicks into place if he declares a climate emergency?
It kind of depends on how he uses the declaration. Specifically, we want him to enact the National Emergencies Act, and that is kind of what lays out some key executive powers. So that's the ability to halt the crude oil exports that I mentioned. He can also, through the National Emergencies Act, stop oil and gas drilling in the outer continental shelf, which is the basically kind of underlies the Gulf and is where a lot of offshore drilling occurs. It's actually about 11 million acres of federal waters currently subject to active oil and gas leases in that region. The president could suspend the operation of all offshore leases with the National Emergencies Act. And then what I mentioned earlier about restricting international trade and private investment in fossil fuels outside of the US, which would halt the flow of billions of dollars of investment in fossil fuels. So that's the National Emergencies Act and his declaration could kick off those powers. Those are really the ones that we're calling for that would have a really high impact on fossil fuel extraction and the greatest emissions reduction potential. But there's also other possibilities under an emergency declaration that would be beneficial as well, specifically directing funding towards renewable energy systems and climate resilient technologies, building out electric transportation. We've seen the president do some of that already with his DPA executive order, and we'd like him to use the emergency powers, which would allow him to move Pentagon funds to complement that and expand the investment he's directed into renewable energy technologies, specifically taking on the transportation sector, which is a huge source of emissions in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, huge. Well, we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back with Molly Morabito of the Climate Law Institute right after these short announcements. And if you're just joining us here at Talk of the Bay, my guest is Molly Morabito. She is with the Climate Law Institute. And we have been discussing a recent report that was created in collaboration with between the Climate Law Institute and Center for Biological Diversity, the Climate President's Emergency Powers. Well, Molly, you've been involved in advocacy work along these lines for a long time, and with the possibility of President Biden engaging the National Emergencies Act to declare a climate emergency, it seems like there's several avenues. You know, there's dealing with our own development of fossil fuel extraction on federal lands. There's exports of crude oil that he can deal with. He can also affect international trade and investment in fossil fuels. And you referenced growing domestic manufacturing for clean energy and transportation. Where's the authority for that, and how does that work? What can he actually make happen?
There's a couple authorities for that. The first is with the National Emergencies Act, he's able to, that gives him like kind of the power to redirect funding from the Pentagon, input it into renewable manufacturing. There's also still more that can be done under the Defense Production Act, which he's already used. And that's an opportunity to spur domestic industry to scale up, in addition to renewable energy technologies, the clean transportation tech. And he can leverage both the DPA funds that gets enacted from that executive order and the federal procurement budget, which would direct around $650 billion per year to help purchase those technologies. There's also currently efforts in Congress to appropriate funding for DPA for specifically the use of non-renewable technologies. So that's those are kind of the options for mobilizing funding around renewables.
Mm-hmm. And there was an infrastructure bill was passed last year, but a second bill, Build Back Better legislation, did not pass. Could he, if under those circumstances, could he direct funding to some of those types of infrastructure projects using the Defense Production Act?
Yeah, it can be used for infrastructure projects, but the main thing that we want the DPA to do is really scale up the manufacturing of renewable energy. But one example of the use of the DPA is improving the energy grid, which is obviously infrastructure and needs to be updated for both resiliency and security purposes, and also to equip the grid to take on more clean energy sources. So that's kind of a place that those things intersect.
Right, because there's what they call, stranded renewables in areas where there's a lot of solar energy available, but there's not a lot of transmission lines. There's areas of enormous wind potential, but there's not a lot of transmission lines. And having that infrastructure in place could make a difference in being able to develop those resources.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a potential for getting hung up in well, I'll just say politics for things like ethanol production or geothermal production or things like that in some cases there may be other groups advocating in the opposite direction?
Yeah, so we mainly want to see the DPA used for technologies that can that can help families and with improve energy efficiency in their homes, that can scale up the use of solar. But there are some areas where, we can see the DPA being used that have other environmental costs to them. So we've been working to just think through those pieces, and there is like a tricky intersection between scaling up renewables and also balancing some of the materials that go into making those products that have an environmental cost. And so there's more work there that needs to be done, but there has been research on ways to kind of hold those two pieces while still initiating the transition off of fossil fuels, which is desperately needed.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything in these proposed executive actions that would address, what I'll call drawdown of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere?
In terms of kind of the carbon capture and removal
Yeah,
pieces?
or even just things like forestry management or, agricultural programs and that kind of thing that can enhance the carbon sequestration that happens normally, but could happen faster if things were managed better?
Yes, to my knowledge, that isn't necessarily outlined in our report, but I could see that being a possibility with the carbon capture pieces. Those are not really the solutions that we need, because they ultimately don't really address the fact that at the front lines of extraction, we have hundreds of communities that are paying the cost of that extraction with their health, and with their well-being. And just saying we're gonna remove it or we're gonna deal with it later doesn't actually address the issues at the source of that pollution, as it's being extracted and refined and produced. So that's not a solution that we are supporting. We don't consider it a solution at all, and that's not really something we would want to see the president direct funding towards. Although there is talk of that being in the climate package currently in Congress, but that's not the type of action we want to see the administration take.
Right. And the report cites, I think, 5 different pieces of law that enable the president to take these kinds of executive actions. And obviously a lot of research went into building this up. Who else, who are the allies of your organization and the Center for Biological Diversity who are right now advocating for these executive actions?
Yeah, so we are part of a coalition called People versus Fossil Fuels, which is now currently up to over 1,200 organizations from across the U.S. that have all aligned around needing to push Biden to use executive powers to address the climate crisis, including declaring a climate emergency, but actually going much further than that and using his existing authority, some of which we've talked about today, to stop extraction and to stop permitting fossil fuel projects, stop leasing, stop exports. And the reason that that's such a core demand is because this coalition is led by Indigenous and frontline communities that have seen firsthand the impacts of that extraction and are the ones really paying the highest cost. And so they have been calling for Biden to enact these powers from day one of his presidency. And in fact, many of these communities turned out to get Biden elected in the first place. And he's promised these specific communities that he would take action. So they are the, the groups and the organizations that have been leading the advocacy and leading the charge for these powers. And at the center, we have a team of amazing lawyers, stellar lawyers, Jean, Maya, who wrote the report, Cassie, the director of CLI, and many, many others did the research on the specific legal powers, but the call for action and the demands really came from the front lines and from grassroots groups.
Yeah, and that's amazing. You said over 1,000 organizations, right, are part of that?
1,200. Yes, over 1,000. We have about 1,200 groups who have signed on, and it's continuing to grow. We actually just had a mass call last night with 1,000 folks who showed up and tuned in, wanting to know how to take action and join our coalition. So we're actually mobilizing towards a day of action on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, August 2nd, where groups from across the country will be mobilizing in their communities to amplify demands for Biden to declare a climate emergency and stop approving fossil fuel projects, leases, and exports. It's that joint demand is really key, because what we don't want is for Biden to make a symbolic climate emergency declaration that doesn't have the kind of bold action we really need. And we're reminding him that even without an emergency declaration, he has powers to stop fossil fuel extraction today. There's so many powers in his toolbox that he can use to scale that back that we really need him to enact.
Yeah, I love how many concrete and specific policies are in this report, because it comes down to needing to be concrete. And here we're broadcasting in the Monterey Bay area here at KSQD, and we've fought hard over the decades to avoid becoming a frontline community. We've had proposals for LNG ports, for offshore oil drilling, for nuclear power plants, for oil storage facilities that have all been forced away, and we've created a marine sanctuary offshore, but through long series of political actions. So we're not a frontline community here. This is a fairly pristine part of the United States. What's going on in frontline communities, places like along the Gulf Coast and a lot of communities in the middle of the country where pipelines and oil and gas fields are in operation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would first encourage folks who have the time to. Those stories are being told by people in those communities. So I encourage folks to kind of reach out and find those organizations and kind of get that account from the organizers themselves. And many of the organizations in People versus Fossil Fuels on our steering committee are those frontline organizations and are those folks who've been fighting for so long at the front lines of fossil fuel extraction. But to give recent examples, we had in the Gulf Coast, where a lot of exporting is happening, just a few weeks ago, or back in June, there was an explosion at the Freeport LNG gas export terminal. And this is just something that residents in the area are unfortunately all too familiar with. And anytime you live near a refinery, I mean, here in the Bay Area, we have the Chevron refinery, which also had an explosion and a massive fire. And we're coming up on that 10th anniversary. We remember, of course, the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf and all the other oil spills that have happened there. The list just goes on, because there's no way to extract fossil fuels safely, not at the source, and certainly not later as they're burned and enter the atmosphere and lead to a host of other problems that affect all of us, whether we live next to a refinery or a pipeline or not.
Right. And it's all going into the same atmosphere that we all breathe. You mentioned, this is a big alliance, a coalition of groups pushing for these executive actions. Have you gotten any feedback from the administration itself or from other people in Washington about the prospects?
It's hard to say. There's obviously a lot of different pieces in the administration and many, many people trying to influence the direction of policy at the federal level. I will say we've had a couple of meetings with the White House where some of our frontline leaders were able to attend. Not as many as we would like, and frankly, not nearly as close to as many as the frontline organizers deserve. I mean, they are really the ones who should have the president's ear, since they have been the folks who've mobilized to get him elected, and they have been the people calling for action from day one that he's promised he would listen to. So a little more access to the White House for our frontline organizers would be really important. And I would like to see the White House listen to them a lot more. But there has been some communication. It's just really hard to know if we'll be, when and how the declaration may come out. There's a lot of things shifting. So we've heard, it could be soon. We know that he's considering it. He said he's considering it. It's on the table and we're close, which is why this is a really key moment to mobilize. So, and this is something that honestly, this call goes out to everyone who is concerned about the climate crisis. This is really the time to take action and demonstrate that there's a strong grassroots movement behind the demand for a climate emergency, behind the demand to transition off fossil fuels, that folks know that Biden can do more. So if you have time, join us on August 2nd, get out with posters, banners, just get out with some friends. It can be you and a few other people. You can tag People versus Fossil Fuels. We're at Fight Fossils, and we'll uplift your actions and try to demonstrate that there is a movement here, and we're fighting really hard every day to get the president to take the action we know he can take.
Are you getting any support from local or state governments anywhere?
Our focus has been at the national level. I'm talking on behalf of the coalition. For the center, we've definitely worked on state campaigns. And there have been like members of Congress who, of course, like represent multiple constituencies who've joined us in calling for a climate emergency declaration. So I would say that there is state and local support and that it's building. And, we'd like to see more governors make the call. They can step up and declare climate emergencies in their own states. Here in California, we're looking at Newsom. He's claimed to be a climate leader, just like President Biden. There's a lot more he could do to make sure that we're actually taking executive action at the state level. It's the same model. It works at the state and local level as well.
Yeah. Wow. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Molly Morabito. She's with the Climate Law Institute, and we've been talking about a report produced by people from the Climate Law Institute and the Center for Biological Diversity entitled Climate President's Emergency Powers. And there is a coalition of over 1,200 organizations, People versus Fossil Fuels. And you said that there's an action day is that August 2nd?
That's right. August 2nd is coming Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. And are there events scheduled? There may be events scheduled in the Monterey Bay area that I don't know about. But do you know? You may know about events scheduled in the Bay Area, Molly.
Yeah, we are planning an action in San Francisco. We'll have the details finalized in a bit, but it's coming on. It'll happen on the morning of August 8th. And I don't know if there's a way I can share a link with you or something that you can get out to your listeners, but
yeah, if anything you send me, I'll include when I post this as a podcast. This interview will be a podcast. So
wonderful. Well, then I can definitely send a link. We have an action map where folks can find actions near them. There will definitely be one in San Francisco or the Bay Area, broader Bay Area. And folks are welcome to join And there may be more actions springing up throughout the state. So I'll send you the action map, and that would be the place for folks to check.
Great. Wonderful. And if people want to get a look at what your organization is doing or get a copy of the report, can you tell us how to access that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's available online. If you Google the Climate President's Emergency Powers, that should bring it right up. We've released a few reports because we've actually had this framework for executive action for a while. So there's reports building since 2016, but the most recent one came out this past February in 2022 and outlines both the emergency powers that Biden would have if he declares a national climate emergency, and also the other executive powers that he has already to address the climate crisis, specifically by scaling back fossil fuel extraction. So that's the Climate President's Emergency Powers report. And if you just type that into your favorite search engine, it should come right up.
Great. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I want to give you, we have, call it almost 5 minutes left. If you have anything else you want to make sure our listeners are informed about in regard to this report, in regard to climate action, and in regard to the climate crisis itself, I want to give you that opportunity to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess I will say, I've been organizing for these things for a long time. And, as a young person, I'm very scared about my future. It can be a very discouraging space to be. I mean, we've seen our government fail time and time again to take the action that we need, that we know it can do to address the climate crisis. And I guess I just want to speak to the people out there who care deeply about stopping the climate crisis and feel a little hopeless right now, because I've definitely been there and I really understand that sentiment. And I just want to say the path to federal climate policy and action isn't over. Whatever happens with this latest round of negotiations in Congress, there is still 2 more years of a Biden presidency. And if he, whether he runs again or not, if he wants to make these next 2 years his legacy and be known as the climate president, which he said he wanted to be, then he has to act. And that will happen only if there's enough people power and mass support and action calling for it. Because, the industry folks, they have their access points. People, the CEOs of oil and gas companies have a lot of power in our government, and they're going to keep doing what they're doing. The only way we can stop them is in numbers and is in people power. And, it can start small with small actions in your community, holding a banner up in front of your member of Congress's office. But taking action is key. It's all we can do. Taking action, getting out to vote, those different pieces. And, it can seem really small. It can seem like it doesn't matter, but it does, because it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening all across the country. And the more that we can amplify that and call people in to join us, the more powerful we'll be.
Yes. And I just want to emphasize, if you're watching corporate media, you're not going to learn about these campaigns. If you're, listening to commercial radio, you're not going to hear about these campaigns. And I hope that in some small way, KSQD, along with all the other public interest media outlets in the country and the world, can amplify your voice a little bit and help people connect up, because it's getting together with others who have the same cares and interests where the power really lies. So thank you very much for all the work you're doing. And I want to encourage everyone out there who's been listening to take a look at the report, at least the executive summary of the Climate President's Emergency Powers Report. And if you are interested in or able to support the work of the Climate Law Institute or the Center for Biological Diversity, do that. And if you want to be involved in the coalition of People versus Fossil Fuels, join up. And Molly Morabito, really want to thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for being on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you so much, Len. Take care.
You too. It's been a pleasure.